Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much to everyone here, either in person or online. Welcome to our final official seminar of the series, although you're very welcome to join us on the 9th of May for our JC Beckett lecture, which will be Clodagh Tate speaking on women and folklore, and that'll take place in PRONI, but also online. So you are very welcome to join us for that. Just a note that this is being recorded, so if you don't want your face on it, please take your face away. Turn your camera off. That is the official way of doing it. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Dr. Jo Curran to speak to us today. Jo is a postdoctoral fellow at Maynooth University on the Preserving and Recording Ireland's Sacred Heritage Project, also known as the Parish Project. Jo completed his PhD at Edinburgh University in 2018. We were in the same cohort, so that was a delight. And the book based on that PhD will be published with Manchester University Press quite soon. And in between his PhD and his current work on the Parish Project, Jo worked as an Irish Research Council Government of Ireland postdoc research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, working on an urban history of Dublin Castle, and that is what Jo will be speaking on today. So please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the good introduction, and thanks everyone for coming along in person and online. I'm going to stand up just because I think it might be a little bit easier to hear me and I can move my arms around. As my title suggests, I'm going to be talking about Dublin Castle and its relationship with the city. Earlier in the year, you know, when you're working on a topic and then you open something from a newspaper, so it's just my second slide there. The Irish Times in January had this feature in its cultural section as a big headline: "Can we finally do the castle justice?" And I was thinking, what is this about, and why haven't I heard about it? And the article, I think it's interesting. It talks about the shabby way in which Dublin Castle has been treated from the point of view of architectural history, public history, and heritage. And I think it does make some interesting points. I think it's fair to say that some of the modern architectural developments that were allowed to happen within the walls of the castle in the later 20th century did cause some problems. But I think the article maybe is a little bit unfair in that it seems to ignore the efforts of staff and scholars that are currently based at the castle and really doing great work in the last decade to try and bring more about the institution's history to the wider public. And also from a historian's point of view, you might think, well, there's been a lot written about Dublin Castle already. You've got that great tradition of writing on the Irish administration, people like Orby MacDowell, Halpin. You've got the debates about the extent to which there was a greening of the castle personnel in the late 19th and early 20th century, work by Lawrence MacBride, and then the counter-arguments by Fergus Campbell. You've got some really good studies of the offices connected with Dublin Castle, or the specific people that held those offices. So studies of individual chief secretaries, Lord Lieutenants, the edited collection on the Lord Lieutenancy by Peter Gray and Alwyn Purdue, and a recent collection on the Viceroys of Ireland as well. And also, along with this, is my next slide there, there's a lot more that's been published recently on the castle's art, architecture, and also the archaeology of the castle. Those based at the castle, particularly Miles Campbell and William Derham, have published a lot of really fascinating things about the castle. And what I particularly like about this is that it talks about the castle as I suppose a place that you're thinking about it as a place within the city. Whereas if you read some of the older work on the Irish administration, you kind of get the sense that Ireland is being sort of governed from the minds of officials rather than a particular place. Now, there's clearly good reasons for that particular approach. The term Dublin Castle is a tricky one, and it can be applied to the broader system of governing Ireland, often used as shorthands for all the government interventions in Ireland. And certainly under the Union, and particularly in its later decades, contemporaries do use the term in that way. But it is also worth thinking about the fact that the term can be used for the castle as a series of buildings. This is sort of from a mid-19th century map. It occupies quite a large space in a fairly central area of Dublin. It is a little bit kind of obscured by surrounding buildings, but it does have a physical presence there. And that's why I think the work most recently by people at the castle is so important, because it takes it seriously as a place within the city. But a lot of this work tends to look at what's happening within the castle itself. There's hints in those collections of the need to look at the connections between castle and city, and Campbell and Derham are starting to work on that. But that's also what I want to talk to you about today. Whereas the people based at Dublin Castle tend to understandably look at its relationship with the city from the inside out, I'm kind of interested in what that relationship is from the outside in, and how the castle appeared to people in Dublin and what they thought it meant for Dublin as a city. As you can see from the dates I originally had, I'm particularly interested in that Union time period. I think this is interesting also just for thinking about the history of Dublin. There's still, I think, when you read about the history of 19th century Dublin, a sense that it experiences this immediate decline on the removal of the Irish Parliament. And this is despite the really excellent work that David Dixon has done, for example, showing that Dublin's decline had multifaceted causes of long and short term duration, that the city went through a series of phases in the 19th century. I would point out a really good exception to this would be Timothy Murtaugh's work on Henrietta Street. It's really good at showing that there's actually slow change happening in lots of different parts of 19th century Dublin. And we shouldn't just think about the 19th century as a monolith. The Union is also interesting for the castle because it's really anomalous in that decade. But that ambiguity perhaps allows it to step out of the Irish Parliament's shadow a bit. So commentators in other UK cities weren't slow to point out that the Union seemed really strangely incomplete. Why was there still a Lord Lieutenant at Dublin Castle? What did that mean for who was responsible for what? And it certainly caused problems, but arguably ambiguity can create possibilities as well as problems. Here you've got, a fairly large complex. It's got multiple ceremonial, administrative, security functions. It's located fairly centrally in Dublin, and it's hard for people in the city to ignore whether they like it or they don't like it. I also, just to explain where I come from in looking at this, my PhD, as I think maybe Sophie mentioned, was on charities in early 19th century Dublin and Edinburgh. And I was interested in how the authority structures in each of those cities interacted with medical and educational charities in each city. And there's a lot of similarities between the cities when it comes to philanthropy. But one big difference was that Dublin Castle was there and it was able to interfere in some of the charities in Dublin. And it's interesting that there's a contrast with Edinburgh, which in principle sort of has a similar position as another deposed or another stateless capital within the United Kingdom, and yet it didn't really have an equivalent to Dublin Castle. Indeed, commentators in Edinburgh weren't slow to criticise Dublin Castle or the Lord Lieutenancy. They seem to regard it with a mix of envy and contempt. If you look at comments from Belfast, there's kind of similar comments coming from Belfast, but there seems to be less envy and more contempt, and they're kind of more confident in their criticisms of the castle, I think, down in Edinburgh. Like many people working on 19th century cities, I've used a lot of newspapers as sources. And a few years ago, I also worked as a research assistant on a project in Durham on the causes of electoral violence in England and Wales in the 19th century. And this allowed me to read loads and loads of newspapers. And what was really striking, I thought, was just the real similarities in the advertising pages of these newspapers and how they were very similar to the advertising pages in Dublin newspapers. So you've got the same kinds of products being sold, the same kinds of entertainments being advertised, and the same kind of philanthropic functions being advertised as well. But one big difference, time and again, was the presence of Dublin Castle in that advertising record in Dublin. And I think, using these newspapers and the castle's place within them can tell us something about how the castle was seen outside, at least from a middle-class perspective. And I think it can also help us to distinguish between the impacts that Dublin Castle had on Dublin as a city, as opposed to the kind of influence that it might have had in the rest of Ireland or other parts of Ireland. The newspaper's advertising sections contain a lot of what we might expect about the castle. In the early years, you've got a lot of proclamations in relation to security and law and order, things that are there in the aftermath of 1798 in relation to prosecutions. And I think this kind of fits in well with what Beatrice de Graaf has said in her work on the Europe of the 1810s and the 1820s. this sort of fixation with security that was very typical of post-Napoleonic regimes. But throughout the Union, including in the early time period, the newspaper contained advertisements for events connected with court and ceremonial sides of the castle. And this was newspapers of a variety of political opinions. So you've got notices for the ceremonies like levees and drawing rooms and the balls that occurred at the castle. And this might affect people that are actually going to go to the castle, instructions for them, but it also affects people in the surrounding area where you've got notices about how the traffic is going to be disturbed when these events are on. The military and the bureaucratic sides of the castles do appear in the newspaper record as well. So in the 1860s, the specialist publication, The Dublin Builder, starts to contain numerous advertisements that relate to the construction and maintenance of barracks. Now, some of those barracks are in other parts of Ireland, but the process of awarding the tenders is being managed by Dublin Castle at this point. Next slide there. There are other things to me that seemed a bit more unusual, although some of you may have seen this example before. It's one of my favorites, and it says the levy as its title, but actually it's not actually anything to do with it's not an official notice at all. It's by an ironmonger in Dublin. This is from the Dublin Evening Mail of 1845, and the ironmongers decided that they're going to try and attract people that are in Dublin attending the levy to come along and saying, well, when you're attending the levy, why don't you come by to our warehouse and buy some nice iron products as well. Perhaps this is one of the more innovative ways in which people try to use some sort of connection with the castle to sell their products. But there's lots of more standard ways that you can find in the newspapers as well, with quite a few advertisements where at the end of the ad, the business will say that they're official supplier to the Lord Lieutenant. And this could be people selling anything from poplins to fruit or things like soda water. And if you look at the street directories from Dublin for 1850 as well, there's quite a few entries, or from the 19th century, there's quite a few entries that will claim to be official supplier to the Lord Lieutenant or the Irish court. Similarly, a lot of charities in Dublin will claim to have the Viceroy or Vicereine as their patron. And sometimes when they're advertising fundraising events and they know that the Lord Lieutenant or the Vicereine is going to be there, they will make a note of that in the ad. On this date, the Lord Lieutenant has indicated his intention to be present, and the aim is to try and get a greater audience. As we'll further discuss, this is part of the fact that the castle is a multifaceted institution. So many, the fact that it had so many different faces, I think, is what allows it to maintain a significant influence on the city. But it's probably also fair to think about there being different phases of the castle's influence over the course of the Union as well. If we just, we'll come back to those businesses in a few minutes, but if we think about the early decades of the Union, as I've said, the graph talks about the significant focus that a lot of regimes at the time put on restoring and maintaining order. But this order wasn't something that was simply threatened by military conflict or resolutions. There's also great concerns about disorder that might follow from the food shortages and the disease outbreaks that accompany the mobilization and the poor weather conditions at the time. And these caused big problems in Dublin, as they did elsewhere in Europe, but they may have provided the castle with some opportunities as well as challenges. The early years of the Union certainly were a time when it wasn't clear if things like the Lord Lieutenancy would survive. When the Lord Lieutenancy did survive, it wasn't really clear what its role would be, and that's never really fully clarified. And the regime's often also rattled by Emmet's Rebellion in 1803, even though that's relatively easily defeated. The fact that it seems insurrection is being planned in an area that's very close by to the castle does seem like a challenge. But there are also other things. The castle was quite closely associated with some medical and poor relief institutions in the city. And during this time of great distress, two of these were quite badly affected by disorder. One was the Dublin House of Industry. This had started as a charity workhouse and a place to detain mendicants, but it was founded in the late 18th century. But by the 1810s, it had become very heavily dependent on state funds, and as well as a charity workhouse, it included a series of hospitals as well and some other medical facilities. And in 1815, over 10,000 people desperately forced their way into this institution, trying to seek relief. In the late 1810s, there was also similar kind of disorder, and another state-funded institution, the Westmoreland Lock Hospital. This treated venereal disease, and there's a hint that the disorder involves some sort of threat of sexual irregularity, but it's not completely stated. But this disturbances provide an opportunity for the castle to reshape the administration of both of these institutions. The Lock Hospital is told to stop accepting male patients completely, and the government makes arrangements for their treatment at another hospital in Dublin, Dr. Stephen's Hospital, which is on the other side of the city, and it pays for this for a lot of the union as well. The House of Industry was subject to a complete change of management, with its 5 paid governors being replaced by a slimmed down regime of 1 paid governor, an assistant governor, and then 7 unpaid visitors. And the castle does have a very well-earned reputation for jobbery, but at this time, the castle authorities did show an interest in promoting what they believed were more efficient forms of administration as well. And I think this is kind of typical of those post-Napoleonic European regimes as well, which were politically conservative, but sometimes were interested in administrative innovation as well. The castle's increased interest in the House of Industry also made that institution reshape its focus a bit. Its original aim of deterring beggars by incarcerating them is something that becomes less prominent over time. And instead, the institution's focus starts to move towards the care of the aged and infirm and those suffering from various illnesses. And it's partly as a result of prompting from officials at the castle that you get 3 hospitals set up in the complex. They're called the Richmond, the Hardwicke, and the Whitworth, and they're called after contemporary Lord Lieutenants. But when we think about these changes, it's not just affecting what happens within the institution. This area of Dublin, it adds to the growing institutionalization of this area. It's an area that's in the northwest of the city, quite far from the castle, but accompanied by other changes. You might be able to see at the top, there's a prison located quite close by. There's also a lunatic asylum, and it shapes the character of this area of the city into later in the century. The castle officials were sometimes prepared to intervene in day-to-day activities in the House of Industry, and this meant there's kind of broader expectations then raised that helps to tie the city and the castle a bit closer together. So there's a lot of letters about admitting patients to the House of Industry, whether these are from fever patients that can't get into another hospital in the city, or they're from another hospital where a patient dies and children are left as orphans, and the managers of that hospital write to the Undersecretary saying, can the House of Industry take these orphans? There's also, it's probably not surprising, huge numbers of requests for different positions at the House of Industry as well. And then my focus here on things related to hospitals might seem a bit narrow and a bit off the point. It's certainly influenced by my previous work on charities, and it can't be seen as the sum total of the interaction between Dublin Castle and the city, of course. But I think it does highlight some kinds of relationships and complexities in the interaction between Castle and city that mightn't be obvious if we looked at other things. And I have a few more hospital examples that I'll come back to later in the paper. It is worth noting that Dublin isn't the only place where we see sort of authorities taking advantage of this early 19th century uncertainty and disorder. Markian Prokopowicz, who's written really good work on what was then called Lemberg, but is now modern-day Lviv in Ukraine, but it was then the capital of Galicia in the Habsburg Empire. And he argues that in the early 19th century, the Habsburg authorities take advantage of kind of uncertainty and disorder to physically reshape the city. They take over administrative powers held by the town's municipal government, and they transform the city into something visually and administratively that looks like one of the Habsburg Empire's secondary capitals. Now, they do this while they're also simultaneously investing heavily in policing. They also restrict the press very heavily. So in this sense, we might see them as a lot more ambitious and more extreme than the Dublin Castle regime. But I think thinking sometimes about these parallels can just raise some themes by responding to the crises of early in the century. The post-Union Castle maybe was able to take a place within the city that was a little bit different from what it had before. Some of this provided a basis for its actions in later years, though in later years it was often interacting with the city in a more subtle way as well. And then if we skip ahead to the late 1840s and early 1850s, we'll see that while the castle and the British government were failing to really respond to the horrors of the famine in any kind of adequate way, and this was something that was complained about in Dublin, it might have also been the time during which the castle was seen to be at the height of its urban influence within the city. It was certainly a time when people in Dublin of a variety of political opinions were prepared to make significant claims about the value of the castle and the Lord Lieutenancy to Dublin as a city. It was also a time when pressures from the city meant that officials frequently got dragged into disputes that they felt didn't concern them. And sometimes Lord Lieutenants or Chief Secretaries started ending up acting against their initial policy intentions. So a good example of this, again, it relates to hospitals, and it relates to the fact that some of Dublin hospitals received annual grants from the Westminster Parliament. These were unusual in the UK contexts, and it looks like they're going to be abolished from the late 1840s as part of a broader effort to promote retrenchment. And Clarendon, as Lord Lieutenant, says he's signed up to doing this, and he starts the process where the Whitworth Medical Hospital, that was one of the House of Industry hospitals, it's ordered to stop admitting patients, and the hospital closes soon after due to a lack of funds. But it's not really clear what happens, but the official story is that Clarendon visits the hospital. He gets so upset by the fact that the hospital is closed and there's no patients in it, that he orders it to reopen with full commitment to its future. The intervention ultimately doesn't just save that hospital, but along with a lot of local protest, it means the government's plans about hospital funding are thwarted. Most of the original funding is retained, and 2 new hospitals start to begin to get support as well. And the castle becomes a little bit more involved with the city's hospitals than it had before, because the Board of Superintendents of Dublin Hospitals is set up. It's appointed by the Lord Lieutenant to report to him annually on the grant receiving institutions. Now, I wouldn't want to sort of exaggerate the influence here. It's a fairly light touch form of reporting, but it does add an extra connection between castle and city that wasn't there before and does develop over the course of the rest of the Union. The fell retrenchment of this time extends to the Lord Lieutenancy itself, with several attempts to abolish it since the Union started. It looks like finally in the 1840s and 1850s that this is actually going to happen, and Clarendon takes office in the belief that he's going to be the last holder. The prospect of abolition causes uproar in Ireland generally, but particularly in Dublin. It's seen as threatening Ireland's distinctive national character, but importantly, it's also seen as an attempt to provincialise Dublin and to undermine the city's capital status. And this was often connected with the economic benefits that the presence of the Lord Lieutenancy was believed to bring to Dublin specifically. And I think this is fueled at this time by the sense of economic malaise that had really pervaded Dublin since the 1830s. And I think that heightened the urgency with which the defenders of the castle campaigned. They tended to argue that the market generated by the castle's presence was essential for ensuring the city's ailing economy didn't collapse further. And you see petitions from a wide range of bodies of various political opinions sent to Parliament, and many of these put the maintenance of Dublin as the central reason against abolishing the Lord Lieutenant. So you have a body like the College of Physicians in Dublin, and in their petition they say, we would never dream of being involved with political matters, but if you remove the Lord Lieutenancy, it's going to really affect Dublin as a city, and kind of hints at the School of Medicine in Dublin will be affected as well. And I've already noted that many Dublin businesses wanted to emphasise their connections with Castle and Court. And what's on the map there is, it's from Tom's Directory of 1850 and the City Directory, and the list of all the businesses on different streets. And I've taken out all the businesses that claim to be supplier of something to the Lord Lieutenant or the Irish Court. So the castle is in red, and the business are all the little blue castles. I think that, you know, what did this mean? Maybe some of these had an official vice-regal warrant. Some of them might have just sold something to the castle once, but they feel that it's worth emphasising this. And it's also something you see in newspaper advertisements, as I've said at this time. And while this definitely continues until the 1880s, there's still quite a lot of businesses making these claims until then. There seems to be a really particular emphasis on it in the 1850s. And I think this kind of sense of economic malaise and maybe the fear that the Lord Lieutenancy is going to be abolished really encourages an emphasis at this time. There are certainly changes in the nature of the castle's influence throughout the rest of the Union, and I don't have too much time to go into a huge number of examples, but I'd like to highlight what I think are some broad trends in relation to the later years of the Union. And I think these can be useful for thinking about why the castle or aspects of the castle were able to retain some influence in the city until quite late in the day, and even among people that would have been hostile to it as an institution or hostile to aspects of it. If we skip ahead again, and until the late 1850s and into the 1860s, one of the most, I think, insightful comments about Dublin at this time, I thought, came from Mary E. Daly, when she talks about the appearance of Dublin changing and it starts to look like a Catholic city. Now, of course, Dublin had been majority Catholic for a significant amount of time. There's some substantial Catholic chapel building before the famine, but it's really in that post-famine period, and especially during the 1860s, during the tenure of Paul Cullen as Archbishop of Dublin, that we see an increasing number of Catholic additions to what we might think of as the city's prestige architecture. And this isn't just churches, but convents, seminaries, charitable institutions and hospitals are very important in shaping this sense of the city physically changing. I think this may have helped increase the confidence of the city's middle classes, Catholic middle classes, even though the city continued to have many other problems. Perhaps it made the castle seem a little bit less important for propping up the city than it had before. But the castle's own relationship with the development of Catholic Dublin, if you like, wasn't straightforward. Yes, increasing confidence might have encouraged some of the city's Catholic middle classes to imagine a future where Dublin could survive without an institution like Dublin Castle. But the castle itself sometimes played a subtle role in the process of making Dublin look like a Catholic city. Some castle administrators worked with and helped to promote things like Catholic industrial schools and reformatories, along with some Protestant counterparts. And the castle's connections with prisons also played a little bit of a role here. Under the Irish Crofton prison system in the 1860s, prisoners worked their way through different grades of prison with the aim of rehabilitation. Men in this system were sent to do the last part of their imprisonment in an open prison in Lusk, in County Dublin, where they worked on a farm. But women weren't sent to an open prison. They spent the last part of their imprisonment in a Protestant or Catholic refuge. And the most significant and lauded of these refuges was run by the Sisters of Mercy at Golden Bridge, which is just to the west of Dublin City. And it's in an area that develops as a prominent area of Catholic institutional philanthropy and other institutions over the course of the 19th and 20th century. The close involvement with government in this and correspondence between them and the religious sisters helps to draw some attention to the refuge and some favourable attention to the religious sisters as managers as well. Another significant development in Catholic philanthropy during the 1860s was the Mater Misericordiae Hospital, which is established by the Sisters of Mercy on the north side of the city. From its earliest years, this is a prestigious hospital. It was hailed, yes, as a monument to Catholic philanthropy that's openly stated, but it's also lauded by British medical experts who, in reports on hospitals in the United Kingdom, talk about the expertise and the design of the hospital. This was an institution that didn't receive parliamentary grants, and in some ways, maybe you could see it as a challenge to the castle's influence on hospitals in the city. This is a new purpose-built institution, not very far from the House of Industry hospitals, which at this point are still state-funded, but in quite a state of bad repair and are constantly criticised. In practice, though, that doesn't really change things. The House of Industry Hospital retains its parliamentary funding, not just until 1922, but actually the Free State report supports it for several decades after that. But Lord Lieutenants themselves were happy to promote the matter, show up at its fundraising events. This could be a little bit controversial in the early years. I recently found a letter in the Irish Times in January 1860 complaining. So this is actually before the hospital opens, but there's a fundraising bazaar and the Lord Lieutenant goes to it. And a letter to the Irish Times is complaining that this is patronage of popery. They're really unhappy that the Viceroy's chaplain has also showed up. And the one thing that they're most incensed about was, as they said, His Excellency threw for several prizes in the lotteries, which are now the general attraction at Popish bazaars, and which, under the guise of charity, encourage the taste for gambling so easily acquired. But I think overall this is quite an unusual complaint. The Irish Times, which was becoming the newspaper of record for Southern Unionism, frequently commends the matter, and it presents it to its readers as an object worthy for philanthropic donations. Individual Lord Lieutenants had promoted Catholic charities earlier in the century. You see Mulgrave in the 1830s doing this quite prominently, but it was a lot more controversial then. And as the century went on, it becomes less controversial. And we do see both Tory and Liberal viceroys making an effort with this. Now, obviously, relations are frequently not good between Catholic clerics and people from Dublin Castle. Paul Cullen and the Tory Lord Lieutenant Eglinton, for example, don't have a good relationship. But the Tory successor of Eglinton, the Duke of Abercorn, does make significant efforts to be more conciliatory. He's noted publicly to have showed particular attention to Cullen at the 1867 Lord Mayor of Dublin's Grand Banquet, and he does seem to have worked to help Cullen to meet with the Prince and Princess of Wales on the first evening of their visit to Dublin in 1868. Now, of course, this isn't just Castle personnel doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They are responding to changing power dynamics in the city. But I think that as well as these kind of more showy aspects, there were some behind the scenes aspects relating to the administrative sides of the castle that do help to facilitate the development of a more assertive Catholicism in Dublin, and sometimes maybe don't get the recognition that they might. Over the next few decades until the end of the Union, of course, there are many well-known challenges to the castle's position in Dublin. Nationalist politicians' boycotts of the castle in 1880s do undermine it to some extent. Separatist nationalism, of course, is a direct challenge, and ultimately the regime is brought down by the conflicts of the 1910s and 1920s. We might even see some things as taking away from the castle that are less direct challenges. The Gaelic League, for example, used to hold annual processions, and businesses sometimes took part in them just for the sole purpose of advertising their products. So they might not have actually been that supportive of the Gaelic League, but it just gives a sense that there's more happening in Dublin now. And people don't maybe have to be as dependent on the castle. And these are kind of the more obvious developments that are happening in the city. But I think in terms of kind of urban change, there's a few other things that also affect the castle's position. These might be related to changes associated broadly with the term urban modernity. There's a lot of debates about what that means and when it happened. Really just what I want to say is that in Dublin, as in many cities, particularly from the 1880s, you kind of have a sort of speeding up of life, technology impacting on life through things like improved city lighting. The cattle trade becomes, the Irish Sea cattle trade becomes very sort of technical and quick, and it's centred on Dublin and its port. You have electrified trams being introduced to the city. You've got even things like greater codified sporting activities, and also things like the expansion of the telegraph network or the introduction of telephones. And the arrival of modernity does affect the castle's position in Dublin, not least changing transport times and communication methods, although that had also been a feature earlier in the century, but it also affects things again at this time. And there are some people who believe that tensions between the castle's traditions and modern technology cause some problems. One person that didn't think this was the Viceroy Aberdeen in the early 20th century. He was very enthusiastic about different forms of modern technology. And he wants to introduce electric arc light into St. Patrick's Hall to film the ceremonies there. But apparently he's overruled by people, officials of Whitehall, who think that this might be going a bit too far and undermine the kind of historic and solemn nature of events. There was also significant bureaucratic expansion that's associated with urban modernity in many cities in the early 20th century. In the Habsburg Empire, this expansion of administrative bureaucratic jobs helps Budapest and Prague to sort of cement their position as national administrative centres within the empire. But I'm not sure we could say that that has the same impact on Dublin Castle. Some of there is bureaucratic expansion in Dublin, but some of the jobs happen at municipal level rather than central government. Certainly, central government does expand as well. In Tom's directory for 1913, there's 49 central government departments based in Dublin, and at least 14 are located within the castle walls, and quite a few others have personnel in their management structures that are associated with the castle, so they're outside the walls, but they might have the undersecretary or the chief secretary on their boards. The extent to which the castle could directly influence these bodies did vary considerably, though. And some of them might have even developed as kind of rivals to the castle. If you think the local government board isn't in the castle, it's in the Custom House, another prestigious building in another part of the city. And it's accompanied in 1913 by at least 5 other government departments, perhaps suggesting that it's a sort of an alternative power centre. And the point here is not that the castle isn't doing anything or speeding up itself, but rather that perhaps it increasingly appears as just one option among many in the city. Nevertheless, there were castle personnel who maintain an interest in modern technology. And of course, I will come back to connections with hospitals there again. By 1910s, the Board of Superintendents of Dublin Hospitals reports are doubling in length. They're only about 60 pages, so they're not, incredibly detailed, but they do contain correspondence with the Undersecretary about things like the installation of electric light, X-ray machines in the hospitals, recommendations about bringing pathology labs into the hospitals, and also recommendations to provide build substantially and provide accommodations for nurses, something that was part of a contemporary interest in the professionalization of nursing. And the quite well-known philanthropic interests of the Viceroy Lady Aberdeen in the early 20th century can also be seen as an interaction between castle personnel and modern medicine. Her campaigns against TB were certainly mercilessly ridiculed by her opponents. Arthur Griffith memorably dubs her Lady Microbe, and she's also ridiculed. This is a poem called The Rings End Babies Club, or it's part of a poem. You might be able to see the details, but it's the poet Brian O'Higgins, and he's talking about her work to combat infant mortality in the working class suburb of Ringsend to the southeast of the city. It's got a mocking tone, it questions her motives. But in writing this poem, he also has to make a reference to the fact that she is working with contemporary medical ideas to influence infant health in an area of Dublin that is at some distance from the castle, not just physically, but also socially as well. So these are really just snapshots and a tiny fraction of the interactions between castle and city. I think they tend to reveal that while there were changes over time, the castle often has this kind of multifaceted, many-sided impact for most of the Union. And I'd just like to end with one final reference. It relates to the Viceroyalty of the Viscount French, the military man appointed Lord Lieutenant in 1918. And his appointment, I suppose, could be seen as marking a retreat away from, I suppose, this multifaceted castle towards one focused primarily on security. The reference is from a publication called The Lady of the House, which was a magazine that claimed to be for gentlewomen, but in practice it had quite a large middle-class readership. And the article laments the fact that because of security concerns, the castle's many faces are being removed and leaving just a single harsh military facade. The article was published or was reproduced soon after in the Dublin Evening Telegraph, which was the sister's paper of the Freeman Journal. So there's a suggestion that the message of it had a broader appeal. And the article focused on the Dublin Horse Show, the annual horse show. Now, this might seem a fairly trivial subject, but I think it's a good metaphor for kind of the obtrusiveness of this security-obsessed castle. It's kind of stripped of its ceremonial tinsel. The author laments that there's now, as I said, no levees, no drawing rooms at Dublin Castle, no gracious viceroy at the Viceregal Lodge, no state visits of the Viceroy and his consort to the horse show, driving in state with dashing escort around the jumping enclosure to the strains of military music. It was particularly upset that last year His Excellency arrived at Ball's Bridge, that's where the horse show was held, and he was arrayed in a somewhat worn mackintosh and accompanied by a bevy of big men who, notwithstanding their mufti, were obviously connected with the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The article agreed with the London Times, which had said that it was incredibly undignified to leave the King's representative on the plane with the man in the street. And the Lady of the House noted that French had now given up all kind of half-hearted pretense at ceremony, that the entire social side of the castle is almost in complete abeyance. And whatever respect the publication might have still retained for the castle, this didn't prevent it from strong criticism of French. It ends by saying, "We hear definitely that the Lord Lieutenant will shortly relinquish the office of Viceroy and leave Dublin Castle. It would have been well for his reputation if he had never entered it, for the military Viceroy has not proved a shining success." And the removal of ceremony certainly was partly due to this crackdown on Republicans and genuine fears for the safety of the Lord Lieutenant and other personnel at the castle. But there are some other changes, I suppose, related to conflict that affect the castle's ceremonial activities as well. During the First World War, the State Apartment is turned into a hospital for wounded soldiers. There's a really good article on this by Sylvie Kleinman in History Ireland that's very easily available online. And of course, I really like this because it involves hospitals. But I think it's sort of a fascinating last gasp of castle philanthropy, where the apparatus of the voluntary hospital actually ends up inside the castle itself. And this is a voluntary hospital that interacts with the public in the same way as many others. It's a real working voluntary hospital. It raises donations. It thanks people for those donations in newspapers. It holds board meetings and reports on them in the newspapers as well. And that's just an image of the hospital there. But nevertheless, and even though French held dances himself in the Viceregal Lodge, I think his viceroyalty did represent an erosion of some aspects of the castle that might have made it a bit more palatable to some Dubliners. The stripping back of the castle's ceremonial layers helped to expose its blunt aggression even more than on previous occasions. It changed Dubliners' incentives for interacting with the castle and removed some of the castle's ambiguity. It removed the layers that those hostile to some aspects of the castle might have wanted to preserve, or at least didn't want to get rid of. The changes certainly helped to reveal that the complexity of the previous century was now being abolished, but that complexity had been important for those in earlier years who were prepared to make at least some sort of pragmatic compromises with aspects of the castle, whether that was just for their own sakes or for what they thought was for the good of Dublin City. Thanks very much.